I do have a costume for every occasion. And I do it because I started doing it when I worked for the Ohio Historical Society. And what I noticed was that building has no windows. Obviously, you have to protect the archives and everything. And so everyone was suffering from seasonal depression because you never saw any sunlight at all. And I realized that just a goofy person in a costume passing out a cookie can change a person's entire day. And so seeing the smiles on the faces of the sisters really is a ministry to me. They're ministering to me with their joy. And oftentimes when people know this, I'll have sisters walk up to me and say, "Oh, what costume are you going to wear today?" And I'll say, "I'm wearing my Director of Founded Ministries costume," which is what I'm wearing for you. Now, Sister had mentioned that my title, Director of Founded Ministries, we put some brochures on the table. These are yours to keep. I've got plenty of them too. And they outline the sponsored institutions of the Dominican Sisters of Peace. Now, over the many years that the congregation has been in existence, they have founded colleges and universities, healthcare centers, and other institutions around the country. And so my job is to have the pleasure of serving them, to help them where they need help, and especially in the area of governance and Catholic and Dominican identity. So I am on the road a lot. It's my joy to be able to spend time in community with them. And it is my joy to be with all of you here today. And I have to say that lunch smells delicious. So well done to the ODU folks. But I want to begin by just reminding of you who the Dominican Sisters of Peace are. I'd like to think you all know this very, very well. But the Dominican Sisters of Peace, if I were to tell a stranger who they are, a group of vowed religious women who have dedicated the last 200 plus years to preach the gospel and make the world a better place. They have not only started Ohio Dominican, they not only founded these other institutions that you'll see in that brochure, but they have also been responsible for laying the groundwork for even whole dioceses in our country. And I would argue that they also were a big part of the development of the Diocese of Columbus out of Somerset and then here at the site of St. Mary's of the Springs. I myself benefited from a Dominican education, even though I went to a public school, because Sister Carol Ann Spencer was my CCD director when I was a kid. And I didn't go to church for the first time until my grandma's funeral when I was 5. And I had no faith formation at home. And my dad one day decided after that funeral, it was time to go back to church. And it was time to get all the kids baptized in some faith formation. My first time at Mass, I asked the priest where the coffin was, because I just assumed there was always a coffin at church. So God bless Carol Ann for having the patience to educate me and to help me to understand what faith is all about. But the sisters have, for many, many years now, been about transforming the world and preaching the truth. And as a Dominican associate, it is my pleasure to partner with them in mission, to be able to preach also. And that's what it means to be an associate. It means you've made a commitment to journey alongside the sisters, to live the Dominican life, and to preach with them. And so if you're looking for an opportunity to preach, join, become an associate, join that mission. You can be male or female, married or single. Father Dan is in the process of completing he's becoming an associate as well, so you're welcome to do that.
Who else are associates?
Anyone else associates in the room? So a couple of you. That means that they get emails from me all the time, right? That's what that means. And what are these chapter direction statements? You heard a little bit about them. For me, these are powerful reminders. If you come into my office, you'll see this is hanging over my phone. Every single call I take, every single email I write, this is better than AI because this forces me to really take a look at what I'm writing and listen to what I'm saying. And am I living these things? And some of them, to be very blunt, kick my butt. Some of them are very intense. The one that really gets me, if you look dead center in the page, working with others to heal the wounded body of Christ in our world. We know that the Christian community is just as divided as our American community is. That's not a shock to any of you. And there are often times when I confront other Catholics and other Christians whose outlook is very different than my own and very different from the congregation's. And then I look over at that card and I'm reminded, how can I bring healing to this conversation? That's not easy, and that's a huge challenge. So those are on cards. You'll see them on posters. You'll probably see them around this building in different forms. What I ask of you is this. Don't let them live there. They're not meant to live on the poster. They're meant to live in here. And so I invite you to draw deeper into those commitments and let them transform you and let you help us to transform the world that we're in. I've been asked to talk about inclusion. Now, I've been working in inclusion ministry for a very, very long time. My children, two of them have special needs. They're both on the autism spectrum. My son, in addition to autism, has a severe intellectual disability. He's nonverbal. And he also has several diagnosed mental illnesses as well. So he is what in Ohio we call a multi-system youth. So I've been advocating for inclusion for them and for other children like them and for families like mine for getting close to 30 years now. I've been involved in that work. My simple definition that is not AI generated is this. Inclusion is an attitude that everyone belongs. Inclusion is not a ramp to get someone into a building. That's helpful. We recently, by recently, I mean 15 years ago, we put an elevator in at my parish. And everyone fought us and said, but we have a ramp. Well, our ramp is so steep, it'll launch you right into Broad Street if you're not careful. Those same people who complained about the elevator, guess what? They're using it now, right? They need it now to get around. Inclusion is not an elevator, although elevators are helpful. Inclusion is not a program, although programs, when they're well done, can be great and can help any institution. Inclusion is an attitude that says to the other person, you belong here. Anyone who ever tells you that you don't belong does not have that attitude. That attitude starts within yourself, and once you have it, you can use it to transform all of the different institutions and organizations that you belong to. So let that be the definition. Okay, that's just the very simple definition. It's an easy one to remember. And if you have a better definition, use it, as long as it captures the spirit of what we're talking about. But that's going to be my definition of inclusion. What we're going to start with here is why this is important, is because this is core to the Christian belief. We believe that every single person is made in the image and likeness of God. Every single one of us. That comes from Genesis. And because of that, every single one of you has inherent dignity that deserves to be respected. Just basically by being human. And so the question becomes, is there anything you can do to stop being human? Well, no, of course not. It doesn't matter how young you are. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter what any physical issues that you might have or other types of illnesses. You are always human, ergo, you will always have inherent human dignity. Now, Aquinas says that flows from the fact that you have a rational mind and soul. That's what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God. But it's indicative of the human condition. Now, we can do things to ourselves. We change over time, certainly. But no one can take that away from you. Now, fun fact, in my family, I had a couple of uncles who each owned their own tattoo parlor. And I have a cousin who is a wonderful tattoo artist. My goodness. And he does paintings as well. He's just brilliant. I'm like the only person in my family without a tattoo. And I've been offered free ones, too. And those of you with tattoos are like, wait a minute, free tattoos, hook me up with your cousin, I will take the free tattoo. And the reason why is because I have diabetes and I poke myself enough. I don't want anyone else doing it. But at one family reunion, my cousin brought a date. I feel bad for her because a date at a family reunion, a little awkward for everybody, right? And this young lady walked in and she was covered from the crown of her head to the tip of her toes with tattoos. Most of them gorgeous. I mean, if you look at them, just as she was a walking piece of art, really amazing. But then she also did a couple of other things where she split her tongue, you know, and then that way she could like do weird things with her tongue. Again, kind of fun to watch, but ugh, right? And then her next procedure, she was telling me, was she was going to get these like little knobs put in top of her head. You may have seen those as well. But the little cousins at the family reunion said, "Oh my gosh, there's a dragon woman here." Was she a dragon woman? Of course not. She was a child of God, made in the very image and likeness of God, who had inherent dignity. And so we believe that any act of injustice is a sin and a violation of that idea. And you may have noticed that after the murder of George Floyd, during many of the protests that were going on, as a congregation, the Dominican Sisters of Peace created a sign that said, "Racism is a sin, period." That's all you got to say about it. You don't need to scratch any deeper. That is a universal truth. Racism is a sin, period, because it is an act of injustice against someone's inherent human dignity. People loved the sign so much that some people took them. And you say, maybe there are people who didn't like the message, but I saw them in other people's yards. Which led one sister to tell me that they should have a sign that says stealing is a sin, period. But please also remember this. When we talk about anything that violates that dignity, it's wrong. And that means we're casting a very wide net there. You also have heard the phrase, if you want peace, work for justice. Now that makes a lovely bumper sticker. I've had it on some of my cars before. That was a quote from Pope Paul VI, and it makes sense. Sometimes it gets reversed in terms of, at some protests, that no peace, no justice, but these two things are intrinsically linked. You have to remember, though, that peace is more than just the absence of violence. All of us would be so happy if we lived in a world with no violence. The bombing in Gaza has begun again. And over 400 men, women, and children have died just in the last 48 hours as a result of those bombings. We live in a violent world, and we pray for peace in that sense as the lack of violence. But even if the world had no wars going on, would we have peace? I would say no. And that's based on Catholic teaching from the Second Vatican Council and Gaudium et Spes that defines what peace is. Peace is the work of justice and the effect of charity. In other words, these two things are connected. If you want peace, you have to work for justice. And peace is also connected to the idea of charity, which we have made so bland nowadays. Right? The original meaning of this is selfless love. It's caritas. It's agape. It's selflessness. If you want peace, you have to work for justice, and you have to love your neighbor selflessly, which is something that, even though it was preached 2,000 years ago, we have never really arrived at. When we're talking about justice, so many of us think about it as something that is punitive or negative. That law and order moment where the DA gets the case and the person is found guilty, and we feel that sense of satisfaction that happens. But justice for us is a virtue. What's the official definition of justice? It's one of the questions I would ask my confirmation students, because I thought it was important for them to know. It is the cardinal virtue. In other words, one of the cardinal directions. One of those virtues that directs all of our moral decisions and behaviors, through which we give God and neighbor what is due to them. In other words, it's getting what you deserve. Don't think about it just in terms of the negative, though. You do the crime, you do the time. For us, it affirms the rights and dignity of every person, because ask yourself this: if someone is made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore they have inherent dignity that can never be taken away from them, what do they deserve? My goodness. That is a very challenging question for you in how you interact with people, isn't it? I would say that what you deserve is everything that you need to be human. Right? If human, image and likeness of God, inherent dignity, then justice for the human is what you need to be human. What do you need to be human? Clean air, water, food, the ability to participate in your family and your community, a decent job to support yourselves, fair treatment, all of those things. Anything that is an injustice to the human is dehumanizing. And I know that there have been times in all of our lives when we felt that way. I remember a long time ago when I was applying for jobs, and every time you applied for what was perfect and you didn't even get called in for an interview, it crushes your spirit. So when we're looking at justice, we're looking at this from the positive perspective. Remember, if you want peace, work for justice. Justice is giving people what they deserve. What do they deserve? Everything that they need to be human. Are we all on the same page here? Good. Now, on your card, you will see that the first bullet point that's on there, or actually double arrow, sorry, it says that we are committing ourselves to continued study of all forms of racism and iniquity, both their historical development and their present-day manifestations. We cannot be afraid to understand our past and to lean into it and to own it. I've been a facilitator for the Diocesan Sex Abuse Prevention Program for 20 years now. I was the very first person trained to do it. I still do it, even though I don't work for the diocese anymore. The very first thing I say at those trainings is, in the Catholic Church, we have had a tragic history of children being sexually abused by priests. Half the room gasps when I say that. But we have to say it. We have to acknowledge it. Then I say, but here's the good news. We're going to teach you how to keep kids safe. You have to acknowledge the past. And so we've committed to studying that, and we've studied that as a congregation even before this latest chapter. But we have to understand that there is a history of exclusion within our own past, even in sacred scripture. Now, there's lots of examples of inclusion in scripture, but there's some of exclusion. From Leviticus, here is an exclusionary law that prevents certain people from the priesthood. Someone who is blind or lame. And when I hear a hymn at Mass that talks about the lame leaping for joy and the deaf hearing, do I get aggravated? I don't like those being used for analogies. Or someone has a split lip or a limb too long. I'm excluded, I think. Or has a growth in the eye, or sores or scabs. They are excluded from that. And this has been used throughout the years to exclude others. In the Middle Ages, if a priest, the law was so particular that if a priest lost a finger, he could not publicly celebrate Mass anymore. Now, you can understand maybe why, because the people might be distracted when the host is elevated or some other things. But we have a history of exclusion there, and it begins even in the Old Testament. And then we also have examples of exclusion that is transformed into hate. All of you, I have my book. Where did I put it? Does somebody take, it's underneath my brochure. Bartolome de las Casas. Has anyone read A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies? Every single person who has ever studied Western civilization should read this. Every single person who is interested in what it means to preach truth to power should read this. He was a Dominican who visited with the Spaniards to the Caribbean. And what he saw is atrocious. It doesn't take long to read it. Get it, please. It's one of the most important texts that has ever been written, because he sees things that every single page when you read that book have a box of tissues nearby. The utter destruction of an entire people. His book, he comes up with a very clever thing. He actually dedicates it to the King of Spain, because if you dedicate a book to somebody, they usually read it. Did it help? No. The destruction of the people still happened. But this is what he says. At a conservative estimate, the despotic and diabolical behavior of the Christians has, over the last 40 years, led to the unjust and totally unwarranted deaths of more than 12 million souls. Now, he says that's a conservative estimate, and we don't know how accurate that is, but he saw so much death that that's what the estimate is. In one heartbreaking case, when he was trying to minister to someone who was a prisoner, one of the indigenous peoples who was a minister, he was very much worried about this poor person's soul and said, "I want to help you get to heaven." And the person said to him, "Tell me, are there Christians in heaven?" And he said, "Well, yes, of course there are Christians in heaven." Then he said, "I don't want to go there." I cannot think of a harsher indictment and an acknowledgement of really anti-Christ behavior than that. So, again, even in our Catholic faith, we have those who are sons and daughters of our faith who have failed in this regard. So get the book, please. I don't get any proceeds, okay? I'm not an influencer, all right? Just a reviewer, not an influencer, right? That's what they say. As Dominican Sisters of Peace, we also have acknowledged our own painful history. We recently celebrated our 200th anniversary, and that began in Kentucky. And some of those sisters who first became Dominican sisters brought with them enslaved people. Other wealthy families could donate enslaved people as well. This is awful. This is terrible, because any form of enslavement is always wrong all the time, period. And I have zero tolerance for someone who says, "Well, so-and-so treated," I don't care. It's always wrong. It's always the sin of injustice. And the sisters have studied this. They've apologized, they've offered programs, they've tried to have a sense of restorative justice to the best that they can. And during this anniversary, we always believe that the record of some of these enslaved peoples were lost forever from a fire down there. But a gentleman who was conducting his own research found records at the nearby parish where the friars were. And so, as part of our 200th anniversary, we erected this monument to acknowledge those folks who suffered at our hands the sin of enslavement. Again, it's awful, but it happened, and we have to acknowledge that it happened, and now we stand against it in all forms, including modern day forms of human slavery. We stand against that as well. Whether it's sisters ministering to women who are trafficked on Sullivan Avenue on the west side, and in other ways, we still stand against modern enslavement. And anytime you're driving past a strip mall, including the one with the Jimmy Johns around the bend, and you see that neo sign that says massage open, I think there's a fair chance that there's victims of human trafficking and enslavement in that building. So what are we going to do about it, is the question. We also acknowledge modern forms of discrimination and exclusion. And we join and we partner with others who are doing their best to fight this. We know that institutions are historically rigged against people of color. We can't deny it. We have to acknowledge it. And we have to do our best to work through it. Even our own education system here in Ohio, I know some of your students know this, was ruled unconstitutional back in '98 because that property tax-based system keeps the poor poor and the rich rich. And actually that lawsuit was brought out of Perry County, a very rural, poor county. And what have we done to fix it since 1998? Not a darn thing. We basically ignored that. And thanks to gerrymandering, I am afraid it will continue to be ignored. Nowadays, we are faced with new issues, or in some ways, old issues that have reared their ugly head once again. This is from a restaurant on East Broad Street, Casuelos. If you've never been there, it's delicious. I go there sometimes. And here a real estate agent was upset that her coupon was not honored. And this was the tip that she left her server. I hope Trump deports you. I would argue that this person does not have an attitude of inclusion. But we must stand with our brothers and sisters. Here's a more recent one. I want to read this quote from Ohio State Senator George Lang. We know for a fact that it costs more to teach a student with severe disabilities. I'm going to make a number up. Let's say the cost is $50,000 a year. It may be 20. I don't know. Compared to a student who comes from a family with a loving mom and a loving dad, who put education at a high level, you know, it costs a lot less to educate those students. As if to say that if you have a child with a disability, you are not a loving parent. Or they don't have a mom and dad, or that mom and dad don't care about education, right? Do you remember what they said to Jesus about the man born blind? Who sinned, this man or his parents? And as a parent of children with disabilities, this makes my blood boil. This happened last week. Okay, this isn't 10 years ago, 20 years ago. This happened last week. I've contacted Senator Lang's office for comment. I'm hoping that he says he misspoke, but he has a degree in communication, so I find that highly unlikely. The other thing we do is we pledge ourselves to take action to move towards eradicating the sin of racism and exclusion. It's not enough to rely on, oh, we have laws on the books about this. We have to eradicate it altogether. And I don't have a ton of time, but I want you to think for a second. Have you witnessed or experienced exclusion in your life? How many of you have? Okay? Maybe you didn't experience it in the same way as another person. Okay, I grew up poor as dirt. Youngest of 6, my dad died when I was 13, we lost our house, I was homeless. I experienced poverty and homelessness. That had a deep and profound impact on me. One thing that didn't hold me back was the color of my skin. That was not something for that. That was a privilege that I had. That doesn't mean I lived a privileged life, because being homeless is still awful no matter who you are. But that was something that never held me back. I don't have a disability. Okay, I'm colorblind in terms of red-green colorblind. So sometimes my green shirts, I think they're gray. And one time I wore bright green pants to a funeral thinking they were gray. But compared to others, that's not that big of a deal. I can live with that, okay? My son Andrew, as I shared with you, is very severely developmentally disabled. Like I said, he can't talk. He's had some major behavioral health issues. And my wife and I wanted him to go to Mass. And what we did was we'd bring him to Mass and we say, how long can Andrew stay? We'd say, okay, he made it through the first song. Andrew's got to go. Okay, that's fine, because he can get really he's very strong and very tall, okay? He's a very powerful guy. Then maybe it was through the gospel. And we'd be like, all right, he made it. And then if one of us had to go, then one of us had to go, right? We were about building up sort of his tolerance and all that other stuff. And then if he made it through the homily, which, let's be honest, is the most difficult part for any of us, we got very, very excited. And he made it all the way. He made it all the way to the passing of the peace. And I'm on cloud 9. But my Andrew, again, because he rocks. And he lulls, he makes little humming sounds, and when he gets happy, he is happy and he flaps, but would sit in the back row, so that's okay. And I was like so happy. I thought, oh my God, you have blessed me with the greatest blessing ever that we made it this far. That means we can go to communion together as a family. And one of us doesn't have to leave us happy. It's time for the passing of the peace. And this is, I went to shake the guy's hand, the gentleman in front of us, and I said, peace be with you. And he looked at me and he said, you can go to hell. Because my son's behavior, which for us seemed excellent, was a disturbance to him. Now, this was before the changes in the missal. And so Catholic muscle memory kicked in. And I said, and also with you. But we felt that sense of exclusion at that point. Maybe you've experienced it in terms of sexism. My daughter has. Every time she got passed over for a promotion at work for a less qualified male candidate. People experience that today with nationalism or nativism, saying that somehow we're so exceptional, that we're better than you, and that you don't belong here. There's many forms of exclusion, and maybe you've experienced it, or maybe you feel called to fight against a certain one of these things. That's really what you can help discern. So we also pledge ourselves to take action to move towards eradicating the sins of racism and exclusion. What do? We educate ourselves. We organize with others. I could not have been nearly as successful with my legislative advocacy if I didn't form some good friendships with some other people who held my values, who were better at certain things than I was, and who taught me an awful lot. Holding institutions accountable. That means both our public and our private institutions. How many of you are participating in any boycotts right now? I am. Because places have eliminated DEI and have made other bad decisions. Do those boycotts work? Sometimes they do. We had a boycott back in right around the year 2000 of Mount Olive Pickle Company because they were not treating their migrant workers fairly. So we boycotted it. That lasted about a year, and then guess what they did? They fixed the problem. So sometimes, don't be discouraged by that. Sometimes it works. We have to challenge racist policies and exclusionary practices. That means you all are in a wonderful opportunity to drive 12 minutes away to the Ohio State House and demand change. Knock on the door of your senator and demand change. If they won't see you, say, I'm not leaving until I get an appointment, and then come back. I've had to do that before. One time, there was a certain Ohio senator who I needed to talk to, and his parents his family owns the Cleveland Guardians. So you could probably figure out who he is. And he saw me coming, and he tried to sneak out the side door. But I know that the side door leads one to the bathroom. And did I, after he washed his hands, talk to him in the bathroom about what the cause was? You betcha I did. Did I get the $40 million I needed? Yes, I did. Absolutely. Financially support businesses, Black-owned businesses, locally owned businesses, businesses that share your values and other organizations. Have those difficult conversations. I know it's easy to unfollow someone nowadays. I know it is. Or block them. Or just to say that I'm not going to talk about this. But just as St. Dominic had the conversation with the innkeeper and listened and spoke, we have to have the courage to do that. And if you have privilege, my goodness, use it for good. Remember, there is a difference between having a privilege and being privileged. Okay, so don't take offense at that. If I say you have white privilege, I'm not saying you had an easy life. That's not what that means. It does mean that you have an opportunity. And 90% of our legislature in Ohio are white males. Can I challenge them and make them cry? Yeah, you betcha, I sure can, so I do. We also have to work in restorative justice. Restorative justice is about healing, and it's unfortunate to me that too often times we're talking about justice in the United States because it's the job of the courts to mitigate all this, that ends up becoming, it means financial gain always, and that can be a part of it, but that's not really what restorative justice is all about. How can we foster healing and dialogue and, more importantly, power sharing? Because oftentimes in the Catholic Church, we want to make people and things the object of our ministry. In other words, I care about Latino youth, so I'm going to start a program serving Latino youth. And we are also called to help other people to be the subject of ministry. To say to that person, I need you to minister to me. You are the doer, not the receiver of that. We need to amplify voices that share our values and create avenues for participation. These are some steps that we can do to create restorative justice. And it's something that is not a one-time thing. It's not something that overnight there's a solution. And it might mean that you have to decide what is something that God is calling you to. For me, God was calling me clearly to advocate for and to minister to the needs of young people with disabilities. I'd like to think that I can talk about all those issues, but not really. I'm not drawn to those, even though I have the same charism. God has given us all different gifts and different passions. One of these issues, all of you can be passionate about, but we're all working towards establishing a more peaceful and a more just world, and we partner with our sisters in that end. Thank you all very much for your time and your attention.